Welcome to 7.3 U.S. History, Revolutionary Politics in the States. During the Revolutionary era, most Americans identified with their local communities rather than with the America as a nation. So the people would vote for their constituents, but think of them as being more like ambassadors than as representatives. So after the Revolutionary War, there were two main sides to the debate within America as to how government should be related to. The first were those who wanted complete democracy. They were more liberal in their interpretation of the law and what government should be like. They wanted government to be a direct execution of what the majority of the people wanted. So the people wanted to set their own tax rates. They wanted to create a militia, not a standing army. They wanted to control their schools and churches, and they wanted to regulate the local economy. And they wanted the state governments only as a necessity for coordinating among communities. So they also wanted to shorten the terms of office to 1 year so that they would be very close to what the constituents wanted. So elections would more accurately reflect what the people really wanted. The second group of people were those who wanted a more balanced government, or what we would consider a more conservative view of government, and that is that it was separated from the direct manipulations of the people, and it was more checked by a strong executive and upper house. So basically the people's will was tempered with an executive power that made decisions independently of what the people wanted. And so the people who supported this type of government wanted to have property qualifications for people who for voters, and they wanted to have longer terms in office, so that the men who were more wise and talented and wealthy would be drawn to the top and would be able to rule the government with more skill than just the average representative. During the Revolutionary War, the 13 states plus Vermont, which made 14 states, were asked to create constitutions, which they adopted between the years of 1776 and 1780. These constitutions were ranged widely between those two viewpoints of government, the liberal or the conservative viewpoints of government. Virginia was the first state to create something called the Declaration of Rights, a Declaration of Rights. It was written by a man named George Mason, who was very, very intelligent and wrote basically the outline form for the American Declaration of Independence, which would be added to the Constitution a few years later as the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So this original document was written by George Mason from Virginia, and it was adopted in the Constitution of Virginia on June of 1776. Many of the phrases that were used in the Declaration of Independence for the Constitution, for the federal government, were actually written by George Mason. Phrases like the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. The Revolutionary era was a period of reform, a spirit of reform. And the men who were involved in the creation of this new country were very into changing things and making things better. So there were three main areas that they tried to make changes in. The first one was women's rights. Abigail Adams wrote a very influential letter to her husband, asking about legislating more rights for women. She argued that women were often under the thumb or the tyranny of men, and she was wanting to see more of a relationship of partnership rather than master-servant. And her husband wrote back, "Ha ha, it seems you're just dreaming," and things like that will continue on for quite some time. Although in reality, it's often the women who are in tyranny over the men. So at this time, women still did not gain the right to vote. Although one state did experiment with giving women the right to vote, but it did not last very long, and that was New Jersey. Women, Abigail Adams argued, should have better property rights and fairer treatment when divorce settlements were made, and also more opportunities for education. So at this point in time, women were not given as many opportunities as we have today. There was also another movement to create a separation between church and state. Thomas Jefferson, who was fairly well known for being not very religious at all, proposed a bill to establish more religious freedom within his own state, the state of Virginia. And the argument was that, the states had been involved in supporting the churches of each area. So in New England, the Congregational Church, which was the church that the Puritans set up, was supported but with government money, and in the Virginia and other places, it was the Anglican Church, which was the Church of England. Well, with the separation of England from England, they also wanted to separate the church from support by the state, and so they argued to create something called the separation of church and state. Another reason for this separation of church and state was that during this time there was something called the Great Awakening, which was a great revival that was going on in North America at this time, or a little bit before actually, and had created many different denominations or types of religious practice within North America. And so it was a bit of a discussion as to which religious branch the government should support. And it was an easier decision to have the government be completely separated from the church rather than supporting one branch of the church. And finally, there was a lot of discussion about slavery within America. It seemed a bit ironic that they were fighting a revolutionary war for liberty, and yet they had a large population of slaves within North America. And there were many of the founding fathers who wanted to see slavery outlawed within North America, but many of the southern states, their economies were based on slavery, and it would have destroyed their economies to outlaw slavery. Thomas Jefferson proposed 3 times during his career in different momentous occasions to have a gradual emancipation of slaves. That meant that slaves born after a certain date would then be considered free, or maybe if they reached a certain age, they would then be considered free. And this was to try to ease the burden, the economic burden that freeing of a slave would have caused the owner. He also wanted to pass, Thomas Jefferson wanted to pass reforms such as public education, the revision of the penal code, which would restrict capital punishment only to murder, only for murder or treason, and but all of these were a little bit longer in coming than during Thomas Jefferson's leadership of the state of Virginia. Thousands of African Americans fought in the Revolutionary War. Virginia and South Carolina were said to have lost about 25 to 30,000 slaves as a result of the war. By 1804, every northern state had enacted something called the Gradual Emancipation Act, which enabled slaves born after 1804 to be set free by the age of 20 or 21. But still, by 1830, there were some slaves that were still left in the North. In the South, Upper South, there was a shift in crops that were grown. Instead of being tobacco, it was more cereals like wheat or barley or corn, and these did not take the huge amounts of labor that tobacco took. So in the Upper South, there was a gradual emancipation also. An example of this was George Washington. He, like many of his peers, when they died, emancipated most or all of their slaves. In the Lower South, however, the crop of choice remained tobacco, and so which is a heavy labor-intensive crop, and it needed a lot of slave labor. And so in the Lower South, slavery remained an institution. During the war of the Revolutionary War, there was a problem with inflation. People were desperate because of the increase in prices and the fall in the value of their currency. The state governments and the federal government were both printing money to try to help pay for their own war expenses. This devalued the total currency, and everyone suffered. The Continental Congress tried to regulate the problem of inflation by fixing the wage and the prices and the wages. This did not solve the problem, however, because it just simply prolonged it and aggravated it. After the war, the inflation problem suddenly flopped over into a problem of depression. And so from 1784 to 1788, farmers could not sell their crops for enough to pay back their loans. So this caused desperation among the farmers. There was also a problem with unbalanced trade. This meant that Great Britain, although it had lost the war, was still one of the main trading partners with the United States. And after the war, most of the industries in the United States had been destroyed or depleted, and so the people in North America had to buy goods from Great Britain. So there were many more goods from Great Britain coming into the United States than goods being exported to Great Britain. And so traders would come and sell their goods, and they only would accept hard currency, so coins that were made out of actual silver or gold. And so all of those got bled over to Great Britain and didn't remain in America. The country was left with very little coin in circulation, and so instead of using coins, sometimes they reverted back to a barter economy where they would trade one good or service for another good or service. Another major problem was the national debt. It had grown enormous during the war, and the Congress was really unable to raise enough money to meet the needs that the debt had created. The Congress was not allowed to tax the people directly. And this was actually one of the major weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. One of the ways that the states tried to help solve the problem of their debts was to start charging a tariff on goods that were imported. So a tariff, it means a tax on imported goods. And the Northeast was trying to protect its infant industries, or industries that were just starting to recover from the Revolutionary War or had just been created right after the Revolutionary War. And so they were trying to protect these industries from goods that were coming from Great Britain. And so the goods that were coming from Great Britain had taxes put on them by the government. Well, the traders and merchants got around that problem by dropping their goods off in ports adjacent to the state ports, or the ports that were in states that had tariffs, and then they would transport those goods overland into the states that had tariffs. So they were sneaking goods into states that had tariffs. Well, this defeated the purpose, and it really frustrated the government that was trying to raise some money for their needs. And so this highlighted another problem that the Articles of Confederation had, which was that the United States really needed to have a stronger centralized government to regulate trade for all the states, and having all the states have the same types of regulations, rather than one state having one type of regulation and another state having a different type of regulation. All of the frustration that was caused by this economic difficulty kind of boiled over in an event called Shays' Rebellion. Daniel Shay was one of the leaders. Well, he had been a Revolutionary War hero, and later he led some of his fellow farmers in a protest against the great amount of debt that they had and the taxation that they were experiencing after the Revolutionary War. He became a leader of the, quote, Committee of the People, which was what they called themselves, who marched at the end in Massachusetts to the courthouse and tried to close the courthouse when it tried to pass judgments of bankruptcy against these farmers. Well, the crisis ended when a militia force was called out to crush the rebels in January of 1787. Shay fled to Vermont, which and basically hid out in the woods until he was pardoned in 1788 by George Washington. And then he lived a quiet life in New York, upper New York, until his death in 1825. But this shows you that his actions were not because he was at heart a revolutionary or a rebellious person, but it was out of desperation that he and his farmers had revolted or tried to use force to solve their economic problems. This, again, highlighted another problem with the Articles of Confederation, because the fact that people could rise up and try to force the government to do what they wanted, and the government being so weak to that they would have to raise a militia to come and put down these revolutionaries or those rebels, caused the government or the Congress to realize that they needed to have a stronger central government to protect the property and the liberty of the citizens, because these farmers had basically borrowed money from creditors who were trying to make money in the loaning of their money to these farmers. So to go and rebel and say, I will not repay this loan, is actually stealing money from the creditor. So even though it seems like the creditor was the one that was not doing the right thing, actually it was the farmers who had made the promise to repay, but then were not repaying. So that's the problem. All of these different incidences helped the leaders of the states to realize that they needed to rethink the Articles of Confederation, and this is what will be addressed in the next chapter.